Steve bringing it hot. You're always good with the funky bass line, Steve. Little white wedding style. There you go. I don't know how I'm going to transition that here to Antonio Maldonado, but we'll do our best. Stash Nation, what's happening, gang? You're back live in the Secret Stash. I'm your host, Jesse Ibanez, co-founder of the Greenhouse Group. And we do real estate down there, Antonio, right here in the heart of San Diego, helping folks get into and out of homes. That's kind of our gang. So if you are in that gap right now, potentially looking to be on the move, then you need help right now more, and direction and leadership more than ever before, because there's so many moving parts. So come check out who we are and what we do over at thegreenhousegroupinc.com. Love to be able to meet you. And we're also meeting somebody here, first time in the Stash Nation, Antonio Maldonado. You can catch him, by the way, at Maldonado-law-group.com. We're talking about cross-border business, which is a big thing right here for local San Diegans. And, I mean, God, do you have a stat on how many people either live in Tijuana and work in the U.S. that cross the border every single day?
Well, I don't have stats on how many people live in Tijuana and work here in San Diego, or vice versa.
Or vis-a-vis,
because there are a ton of people that live in South County,
totally,
in the Otay Ranch, East Lake area, that work in Tijuana.
I've helped find a lot of those people homes.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. And so there's a ton, but this is the largest border crossing in terms of volume, in terms of people crossing the border in the world. How many a day? I have absolutely no clue.
But, I know, right? That'd be a fun number,
it's
though.
It's hundreds of ththousands per day, I'm sure.
What a job that must be to be those Border Patrol guys, man. Jeez.
Yeah, it's a tough job.
Speaking of, though, we almost kind of set ourselves up there rather organically, because one of the things I wanted to get your expertise around is something that a conversation, you might say, that I've been following since all the way back before the big bust. Mm-hmm. This was probably 2003, 4, really started picking up traction around 2005, maybe peaked in 06, and then kind of fell apart when the rest of the market fell apart, which is real estate in Mexico, specifically the ginormous contingent of expats that have retired and bought homes down in Mexico. But it's not like buying a home here in the United States, is it?
No, it's not. It's a very different process in the sense that that you don't have real estate brokers that are licensed like we have here in California. You don't have escrows as an integral part of the sales process. What you do have is series of contracts, and then signing this deed, maybe if no Mexican national is purchasing the real estate, then having a bank as a trustee for a Mexican real estate trust, and everybody signing up at a Mexican notary public's office to sign the deeds. And so it's a very different process. And
you mentioned the bank, you mentioned the word different in the same breath. Boy, that's an understatement, because first of all, lending is incredibly difficult. As I understand, I shouldn't speak from personal experience, right. And if you're lucky enough to get, to have the collateral to get the loan, the interest rates are completely different than what we're used to here in the United States.
Very true, but there are some lending companies here in the U.S. that do lend on real estate in Mexico, and so there is that. But for normal Mexican citizens, it's very difficult for them to access mortgages.
Right. So let's get into that, if I might. So I got an expert here in the house. I mean, that nobody better to help shepherd us through this conversation. How would somebody purchase a house in Mexico? Like, maybe you can give us the 101, and then you can kind of get down into the details a little bit as you see fit.
And I'll contrast it a little bit with what the process is here in California. Usually, the first step that you have here is you would submit an offer, and you would use the CAR forms. And what I'm talking about is the California Association of Realtor forms that you have for these offers. Mm-hmm. And then you have this negotiation going on between the buyer and the seller. And once the buyer accepts an offer, or the seller accepts an offer, then you have a deal. That is the agreement. There is no other agreement. And then you start escrow with that. In Mexico, it's different in the sense that in reality, you don't have those CAR forms. You don't have any of that. Some realtors in Mexico have prepared their own forms that are similar to what is used here in California. But the reality is that they're not legally binding agreements, and even if they're accepted, you can't enforce them through the courts. And so what you do is and so the first step is preparing a purchase sale agreement, and this is typically a 5, 10, 15, 20 page agreement that's between the buyer and the seller, and that is the agreement that essentially contains all of the terms of what will happen in this sale. And once the seller and the buyer agree on those terms, they sign the agreement, and then at that point, depending on how this transaction will take place, then they have to, put some money down, maybe open an escrow. Many times it is with a U.S.-based escrow company. Sometimes it's not. Maybe it's an escrow company based out of Mexico, but it works a little bit different. And then once you get if the buyer is not a Mexican citizen, then they need to set up a Mexican real estate trust.
Now, here's where the rubber meets the road, right? Because, first of all, this was the big sort of development, you might say, pardon the pun here specifically, in how Americans could buy homes, because you can't as a citizen. So then there was that whole thing about like the lease thing, like the 99-year lease, and that got luckily trumped with the idea that you could actually set up a trust, right? And then that would be sort of the security element.
Yeah, well, it's
that would be able to indemnify the banks.
Right. Well, yeah. In the sense that the bank, it would be the nominal owner of the real estate. It wouldn't be the foreign citizen, the U.S. citizen, or whatever. Here, we don't. Well. In Mexico, you don't have 99-year leases. That's a common misconception.
Right.
And it turns out that many times when people purchase leases and then build homes on those leases, they aren't figuring it out in the sense that you can't lease real estate in Mexico for a term of over 10 years. And so they're getting duped into these agreements. They're building the homes. They're spending $100,000 on construction, and they're not even the owners.
And I didn't even frame that correctly. I should have put the word myth in front of that, because you're absolutely right. Yeah, it was a myth.
That's right. Yeah. And so when you do enter into an agreement for the purchase of real estate, and you're not a Mexican citizen, then you need and the property is located within 100 kilometers, about 60 miles from the border, or 50 kilometers, about 30 miles from the coast, then you have to set it up through a Mexican real estate trust. Because if you're not doing it that way, then you're not actually taking title to the property. And when you do set it up that way, the bank is taking title, but they're doing it as your trustee through this trust. And so you're the beneficiary as the beneficial owner, and you have the right to sell the property, to encumber it, to put a mortgage on it, to lease it, do whatever it is that you could do as an owner. But you do need to set it up that way. And if not, then you're setting yourself up for failure. Now,
is that an irrevocable thing, or can the change in government policy trump that, and that whole thing?
Well, there's something in the Mexican Congress right now that would essentially eliminate the need to have one of these Mexican real estate trusts. And so if this bill gets approved by the Senate, Mexican Senate, then U.S. citizens will be able to own directly coastal property and border property. And so maybe there will be a possibility that these Mexican real estate trusts will not be needed anymore. And so that it can change.
So currently, are they revocable?
Well, they're revocable in the sense that the beneficial owner can give instructions to the bank, and the bank has to follow these instructions so that the trust is terminated and the property is transferred to someone else who can take title to the property. And it could be some other bank through another trust, or it could be some purchaser.
So by the own will of the actual owner, though, so they can't pierce the veil from the outside and say, like, everybody who did that, now your trust is no good, and we're taking back your property.
No, if you're talking about condemnation and expropriation, no, that can't happen. And if it ever did because of public utility, then just like you would have a situation like that here in California, you would have the Mexican government in those cases paying market value. And that is one of the benefits of NAFTA, actually. NAFTA gives U.S. and Canadian citizens a protection that Mexican nationals don't have. Mexican nationals
I didn't know that.
Yeah, Mexican nationals get paid on an appraisal value that is set up by the same Mexican government.
Right.
But U.S. citizens and Canadian citizens get paid based on our market valuation. And so there's a big difference, and that is actually on account of NAFTA.
I love that thought. And then so you can still use American banks to purchase those. I'm sure there's probably a little risk margin, right? It's probably a little bit more expensive than it would be if you're buying just a property.
That's
right. Are you aware
it's a
of
couple of points
points higher, okay.
Yeah.
But still, man, I mean, with rates being where they are right now, historically speaking, what a great option for, someone to go retire. Because that's really what it comes down to. I mean, Mexico is one of the most beautiful places ever. I mean, we vacation there all the time.
Very true.
And then the cost, and right now, man, never been more true. I just saw on the news yesterday, it's like at 16 cents or something like that.
You mean per peso?
Yeah.
Well, the exchange rate is 16. It's almost as 16 pesos per U.S. dollar.
Right. That's
Yeah, and it's about 15.7 pesos per dollar, and so
which is pretty.
The dollar does go much further in Mexico than it does here.
Yeah,
very true.
That's a good thing, I guess, in one perspective. But man, it's also a challenging stat, for.
That's true, and I guess that's something that in some senses is good for trade as well, because the U.S. dollar can buy that much more in Mexico goods.
Right.
And so
that's the part that it's good for. For Mexico, it's
for the U.S.
step in the wrong direction.
Yeah. True. Very true.
It wasn't too long ago where it was about 10, I think, 10 or 11.
Well, that was several years ago, but then it was for 13 to 1 for a very long time. For about 4 or 5 years, it was about 13 to 1, and now it's a little bit higher. But of course, the other factors that come into play in connection with the Mexican economy is what is increasing that exchange rate to go up.
And gang, you can see why we wanted Antonio Maldonado to come on the stash so badly. Thank you so much for spending some time, brother. Maldonado Law Group. You can check him out at Maldonado-Law-Group.com, or you can call him right downtown San Diego at 619-342-1422. That number once more, 619-342-1422. So gang, coming up, we're going to put a little bookend on this concept of cross-border business relations and all that good stuff, all things outsourcing, even got into the weeds of some real estate stuff. So there's going to be one thing that you've got to know about this conversation if you are in either of those two spots respectively, either business here in the U.S., trying to trade with Mexico, or vis-a-vis, that you're not going to want to miss. And Antonio is going to share that secret right after the break. We'll be right back.